Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's devotional. Another quick thought for you today from Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verses 11 and 12. Solomon says, I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill, but time and chance happen to them all. He's not saying that the swift don't that they never win the race or the strong never win the battle. His point is that man's determination of what should happen isn't what necessarily is going to happen. You would automatically assume that the fastest person is going to win whatever race is being run. You would assume that the strongest army or the strongest person would win in whatever battle they fight. You would assume that the wise men would always have bread to eat because people value their wisdom. You would assume that men of understanding, who advisors and people that kings might seek after, would always have riches because people valued their understanding. You would assume people of skill would have favor from others, or for that matter, the concept of skill, whether it's skill in an endeavor, skill because they're well trained in something, and so as a result, whatever they put their hand to do according to their task, because they're skilled, it will come out favorably, but that's not necessarily the case. Solomon says time and chance happen to them all. Now, he's not speaking from God's perspective. It's not that God rolls the dice to see what happens. God allows things to take place. He allows bad things sometimes to happen. God doesn't cause bad things. He doesn't cause evil to happen. But certainly God sometimes allows things to take place. But from man's perspective, it's time and chance. Because there's no way for us as human beings to know. God knows what is going to happen. He knows what the future holds, but we don't. And all of Ecclesiastes is being written from a human perspective. It's not being written from God's perspective. It's written from man's perspective. And so when Solomon writes these things, he acknowledges that first of all, we can't see in the future. But also, things don't always go according to plan, and they don't go according to the way you would expect necessarily that they would go. He then applies that in verse 12, for a man also does not know his time, like fish taken in a cruel net, like birds caught in a snare. So the sons of men are snared in an evil time, when it falls suddenly upon them. He's talking about life and death, talking about things that take place that bring about, verse 12 is primarily talking about death, but even sometimes bad things that happen. Again, God allows things to take place, and certainly his providence enables us to have the strength to endure the things that we encounter in life, that God allows us to go through, but we also know that God will never allow us to be tempted beyond what we're able to bear. But what Solomon describes here is the complete contrast of how man sees a thing versus how it really is. Again, man's assumptions, man's wisdom, man's automatic thought process compared to how life is. And that as far as we're concerned, time and chance happens to everyone. The best laid plans that we can put forward doesn't necessarily mean it's going to amount to anything. This is why it's such an interesting connection with what James says. In James chapter 4, at the end of the chapter, James describes the sinfulness, the evil aspect of boasting, assuming that we have tomorrow. He says in verse 13, "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell and make a profit. Whereas, verse 14, you do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. But now you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. The importance, what James says here is not that we shouldn't make plans. That's not what James is saying. It wasn't wrong for them to make plans. This is what our plan is. What was wrong for them was to assume that they were going to live and that the Lord that the Lord wills that they accomplish those things, that they do those things, that they actually live to be able to do those things. And this is why he says in verse 15, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. This is the problem, was they were simply taking for granted that tomorrow's going to come. They're taking for granted that they'll be here tomorrow. And that's part of this arrogance and boasting. And it's interesting because they don't boast in verse 13. But it speaks to that, this boasting, this arrogance, it speaks to that taking for granted. And certainly we could talk about a lot of things that we take for granted all the time, that we shouldn't. And that's why it's so important to remind ourselves of the blessings that God gives us each day. Some of the things that maybe we don't even think about over the course of a regular day. Some of the smallest, maybe even things that we would never really think about until they're not there anymore sometimes, that we need to be reminded to thank God for. But especially when it comes to things like waking up in the morning. There's no guarantee that when we go to sleep tonight that we're going to have a tomorrow. And it's important that we take to heart what James says. Do not take tomorrow for granted. If God wills and you live tomorrow, then you can do this or that you have planned on your schedule for tomorrow. But what's also implied here is that if and when God gives you tomorrow, thank Him that you've been granted that day. Thank Him that you have another day that you can live in this world with your loved ones, with our brethren, to be a good example to others, to maybe correct areas of our life where maybe we're lacking, that we don't have to meet the Lord in judgment, not having had the chance to correct something in our lives. We need to remember that we can't take our lives for granted, and that's something that is cliche to say, but it's this very thing that James condemns the brethren for taking for granted. That they are just assuming you'll be around tomorrow, and you're just going on each day, and you're not really thinking about what the Lord's will is, and if the Lord's will includes you in it tomorrow. All right, that's the devotional for you today. Lord willing, our next devotional will be tomorrow at 6:30. I hope to see you all then. Thank you, everybody.